Trump is also the reason millions of Americans are now unemployed. He inherited the longest economic expansion in history from Barack Obama and Joe Biden. And then, like everything else he inherited, he ran it straight into the ground. Because of Trump's failures of leadership, our economy has taken one of the biggest hits out of all the major industrialized nations, with an unemployment rate that has tripled as of today. This is what happens when we elect a guy who just isn't up for the job. Our country ends up in tatters. But here's the good news. We don't have to accept the failed government of Donald Trump and Mike Pence. In just 83 days, we have a chance to choose a better future for our country. So, Joe, Dr. Biden, thank you for the trust you've placed in me. And 30 years ago, I stood before a judge for the first time, breathed deep, and uttered the phrase that would truly guide my career and the rest of my career. Kamala Harris for the people. Because electing Joe Biden is just the start of the work ahead of us. And I couldn't be prouder to be by his side, running to represent you, the people. Thank you, and may God bless the United States of America.
Can Kamala Harris effectively prosecute the case against Donald Trump to ensure that his inaugural term is his last? And what will she bring to the Democratic ticket as the first African American and Asian and Indian American woman ever nominated to a major party ticket for president? Abdullah Fayyad is an opinion writer and member of the editorial board for the Boston Globe, and he joined me this week to provide his perspective on the historical and political significance to Harris being named as Biden's running mate. I'm Kevin McShann. Let's have this conversation. Regardless of your political ideology or which side of the aisle you want to win in November, the appointment of Harris as Biden's VP is both historic and visionary in nature. So Fayyad began by reflecting upon both the historic and political significance of the selection of Harris.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a historic appointment or choice by the Democratic nominee. This is the first time in American history that a vice presidential candidate for a major party is a Black woman, and in this particular case, a biracial woman. She's also an Indian American, and that's a huge deal. It's a huge deal because this is a milestone. It's taken many movements for this occasion to come, for a viable vice presidential candidate who is a Black woman to potentially win the election. So that's a huge deal. And especially looking at the Democratic Party, which relies heavily on women voters, and in particular Black women voters, this was really critical to show where the party stands. So from that aspect, I do think that Kamala Harris's candidacy is historic and is a really important milestone for the country.
And I'm just curious to get your compare and contrast of the two conventions we've seen so far. Certainly, the Democrats' convention was more of restoring stability and competency to the West Wing. And then the Republicans, it seems the first two nights have been all about airing their grievances against the Democrats. But what struck me is that Trump is the one in charge. So isn't the RNC just an indictment on what she's done wrong the last 3 years? Because it seems like they're complaining about, they keep saying the radical left Democrats, but what the Republicans don't seem to realize is that Trump is in charge. I just wondered your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, the RNC, the tone of the RNC right now is very doom and gloom, and it's almost as though they're not in power. The party right now, the Republican Party, is campaigning through its grievances with the country. And usually that's what an opposition party would do. But they're the governing party. You know, Donald Trump is president of the United States. So, you know, if you're complaining about, you know, unrest in the streets, you know, you're the one presiding over the unrest in the streets. And so there is something that doesn't really make sense. The messaging of the Republican National Convention doesn't make sense when you consider the fact that the speakers are representing the party in power. They're really not acting like they are the party in power. And yeah, that's creating this kind of awkward, you know, message that doesn't really make sense.
Now, obviously, we've seen the unfortunate shooting of Jacob Blake this week in the news, and certainly racial unrest from George Floyd to Ahmaud Arbery to Breonna Taylor will certainly be a driving force for the election. But it seems as if the Democrats are talking about it and the Republicans just want to gloss over it. And it doesn't seem like there's been a national reckoning in the White House about the importance of race relations. So I'm just wondering, how do you think that's going to play out in the election as well?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know how it's going to play out in the election, but what I, you know, do know is that, you know, what Jacob Blake shows is that there hasn't really been a change in policing in this country. This is another high-profile shooting. Fortunately, Jacob Blake has so far survived, though he is permanently disabled, according to his father. And so, you know, he was shot in the back 7 times in front of his kids. And this is after 3 months, more than 3 months now, of, you know, consistent protests against police brutality. And when you look at the numbers comparing this year to last year, police shootings have not changed. Police violence has not changed. So right now, you know, you have millions of people marching in the streets. You've had that since the beginning of the summer. It has waned a little bit, but it's picking back up now as a result of Jacob Blake's shooting. And you have a president who's just not willing to answer to any of these people. This is something that he doesn't show any kind of compassion about, nor does he show any kind of impulse to do something about it. So, you know, for everybody in the streets protesting police brutality, they don't have an ally in the White House. And so if that translates to votes, then it'll negatively impact the president. He doesn't seem to care about what's going on right now.
And I'm also wondering, circling back to Kamala Harris, well, your initial thoughts on her acceptance speech and the rollout of her announcement as well.
I mean, I think it was a very successful rollout. I think, you know, it drew a lot of attention. People were very excited. And I think her convention speech was very good. She was able to neatly tie together her story with the American story more broadly. And, you know, it's inspiring for a lot of people. You know, it's just, it's this unique moment in history, and she was able to message that through her own story, and I think it resonated with a lot of people. And I think based on just people's reactions afterwards, it seemed to especially resonate with Black women. And that's a critical element to the Democratic Party winning, is to energize the base, and the Democratic base is largely Black women.
And certainly, Biden's not going to win just because he nominated a Black woman to be vice president. So, what do you think in the remaining 60 or so days left until the election, the Biden-Harris ticket has to focus on in order to fortify their election to the White House?
I don't really know. I'm not a campaign strategist, but I do think, I think what they've been doing has so far worked. Biden's been treading this, delicate balance between, answering to the progressive left of the party, that wing of the Democratic Party, while also not alienating centrists and even center-right people, and including former Republicans. So he's trying, and Kamala Harris now is trying as well to build a very broad coalition with a big tent that includes ideologies, that are, far left and, right wing at the same time, just anti-Trump. So, it's a delicate balance, and it's hard to, see that sustained for a very long period of time before there are fissures. But so far, they've been doing a good job at it. Obviously, there are some grievances that different factions of the Democratic Party have with Biden's candidacy, and now with Kamala Harris's candidacy. I wrote about this, but I was saying, Kamala Harris's candidacy is a very historic and important step for the country to take. But at the same time, she's not necessarily the candidate that the left wing of the Democratic Party wanted. And, they have concerns over her prosecutorial record. So, it's hard to see a smooth kind of, they're not going to be smooth sailing to November, but so far they're in good shape. But there are definitely ways that this can go wrong for them.
And you bring up a prosecutor record, and obviously that's the first thing, one of the first things that the other side and Trump's campaign is going to focus on. So how do you think they effectively combat that?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, there's this, impulse to not criticize Kamala Harris's record or Joe Biden's record when it comes to its impact on Black and brown communities, because there's this worry that, the Trump campaign is going to seize on that and, discourage people from voting for them. But, in reality, any criticism that comes from the Republicans about Kamala Harris or Joe Biden on their record on race, it has to be coupled with their own record on race. And so, they don't really have any good standing to be making these criticisms, because right now, in spite of disagreements that a lot of movement activists might have with Kamala Harris as the choice for VP or with Biden as the nominee for president, with Biden Harris, they would have people in the White House who are much more likely to listen to their cause than the people occupying the White House right now. So it's, the movement was never about electing a certain individual to the White House. It was about, creating a sustained social movement that lasts well beyond this election, no matter who wins in November, to keep pushing politicians to do the right thing so that, there is more accountability on police, so that there is actual reform in law enforcement, so that they no longer exhibit the systemic racist behavior that we have seen since forever. So, that's what this movement is about. And so the campaign, the Trump campaign criticizing Kamala Harris on her prosecutorial record, they really have no standing to be making that criticism, because people know the Trump administration and what the Trump administration has done, and their record is far, far worse. It doesn't even compare.
And I'm just curious to also get your thoughts on, obviously, the messaging, as we talked about earlier, is starkly different on both sides. So watching the first two nights of the convention for the Republicans and watching the Democratic convention, do you think it'll move the needle either way, from people who supported Trump in 2016 and said, I took a chance or a flyer on him in 2016, but I'm not willing to do it again this time?
It's possible. I don't know how many undecided voters there are right now. I think, the thing about Trump is that he's such a big personality, and so polarizing, that it's difficult to imagine that many people kind of just casually voted for Trump and kind of might have second guesses. It feels like once somebody hops onto that train, it's very difficult for them to hop off. So, I'm sure there are voters who will switch from Trump to Biden. That'll definitely happen. I don't know if it's going to be on a scale that's large enough to be the deciding factor this election. I do think this election will largely depend on turnout of each party's base. There will be some people in the middle that might make a difference, but we won't know that till November. I mean, some polling has already indicated that there is a large shift, particularly among women, white college educated men, and even, Trump's, what is perceived to be Trump's biggest base, which is white men without a college degree. There has been a shift from them towards Biden, though they still, the majority of them still support Trump. But there has been this shift. So some people are moving from Trump to Biden. I just don't know if it's a large enough number to be the deciding factor this election.
And do you think, what do you make of the argument of Biden is staying in his basement to win this election, and it has to go out to the battleground states and be more visible? I'm just wondering what your initial thoughts are to that argument.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very unconventional, unprecedented campaign. For presidential candidates to get their message out, they travel the country. They have rallies in multiple states each day of the campaign, and so this is totally irregular. And Joe Biden, in particular, likes to have those crowds to go speak to and kind of do his stump speech. So being in a basement, could have negative consequences in turnout, because people aren't having rallies in their cities or towns, and so they might be less energized to go vote. At the same time, it's important for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to continue showing good protocol when it comes to social distancing, and not encourage people to gather in large groups, because we still don't know. We still have not contained the coronavirus. So there is, a need for this kind of campaigning from the basement. I think he's being visible enough. He is doing interviews. He's, doing all these speeches and addresses from, his home. And he has traveled a little bit around, but just keeping it on the down low a little bit, I think, is critical when the virus is so unpredictable right now, and might get much worse before November.
And what do you think about the notion of the fact that the Democrats are laying out specific policies, sort of one of the rallying cries for the Republicans? And quite frankly, I've watched the first two nights of the RNC2. They really haven't laid out their policies either. It's been more of a grievance fest. So I'm just wondering your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, the Republican Party has really not articulated at all what it's going to be doing in a second Trump term. I mean, they didn't even vote on a Republican Party platform this convention. Practically, their platform was just supporting Donald Trump absolutely. You know, this is very irregular. They kind of did not vote on any kind of ideological um, accomplishments that they wanted to achieve or ideological goals that they wanted to achieve, you know, in a second Trump term. Practically, they just said, you know, this is a license for Trump to govern however which way he pleases should he win a second term. And that's kind of wild. You know, that's very irregular. And so, um, you know, I think that might not work for voters. I mean, people don't know what they're voting for when it comes to policy. They're voting for a personality when it comes to Trump. You know, and some people like it, some people don't. He's very polarizing. And, you know, I think this election is really just about, you know, what Trump himself has chosen to represent. And, you know, he is this very polarizing personality. That's practically it. That's all that voters know, and that's what people are going to be voting for. It's not going to be about his policy. You know, no one really can tell you what Trump is actually going to do about trade in his second term, or what Trump is actually going to do about healthcare in his second. He hasn't articulated a healthcare policy for his second term in the middle of a pandemic. So, you know, people and healthcare is something that everybody is worried about right now. You know, 40 million Americans, around 40 million Americans are out of work in a system where your healthcare largely depends on your employer. So how Trump is running without kind of articulating these kinds of policies and expecting that people are going to vote on policy is going to, you know, it doesn't really make any sense. So I do think people are mostly voting on Trump, his personality, and what they think Trump represents.
Today, that country feels distant. Donald Trump's failure of leadership has cost lives and livelihoods. If you're a parent struggling with your child's remote learning, or you're a teacher struggling on the other side of that screen, you know what we're doing right now is not working. And we are a nation that is grieving the loss of life, the loss of jobs, the loss of opportunities, the loss of normalcy, and yes, the loss of certainty. And while this virus touches us all, we got to be honest, it is not an equal opportunity offender. Black, Latino, and indigenous people are suffering and dying disproportionately. And this is not a coincidence. It is the effect of structural racism, of inequities in education and technology, healthcare and housing, job security and transportation, the injustice in reproductive and maternal health care, in the excessive use of force by police, and in our broader criminal justice system. This virus, it has no eyes, and yet it knows exactly how we see each other and how we treat each other. And let's be clear, there is no vaccine for racism. We've got to do the work for George Floyd, for Breonna Taylor, for the lives of too many others to name, for our children, and for all of us. We've got to do the work to fulfill that promise of equal justice under law. Because here's the thing, none of us are free until all of us are free. So we're at an inflection point. The constant chaos leaves us adrift. The incompetence makes us feel afraid. The callousness makes us feel alone. It's a lot. And here's the thing, we can do better and deserve so much more. We must elect a president who will bring something different, something better, and do the important work. We must elect Joe Biden. Joe, he believes we stand with our allies and stand up to our adversaries. Right now, we have a president who turns our tragedies into political weapons. Joe will be a president who turns our challenges into purpose. Joe will bring us together to build an economy that doesn't leave anyone behind, where a good-paying job is the floor, not the ceiling.
I'm wondering also, one of the reasons that Biden picked Harris is because he wants to sort of prosecute the case against President Trump. So I'm wondering how you think Harris will assist with that, and also just more broadly, other than being the first African and Asian American woman to be nominated to a major presidential ticket. What else do you think, from a policy standpoint, Harris brings to this ticket?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. I think so. To answer the first part of the question, I do think Kamala Harris is especially talented at making the case against Trump and kind of prosecuting that case. She's a good prosecutor. She's in the sense that she does her job well. We've seen this in her role in the Senate during hearings. Her lines of questioning tend to be grilling, and they tend to be very effective. So that aspect of her experience is probably helpful for Biden. At the same time, when it comes to policy, what Kamala Harris's presidential campaign failed to do was articulate a clear set of policies that she wanted to enact. So, she kind of was a little bit all over the map when it came to policy. So at first she went in Medicare for all, said that she was going to abolish, private insurance, private healthcare, and then that started to change quickly as her presidential campaign started picking up, and beyond healthcare as well. Her policies were just kind of all over the place, and no one really understood where she stands. So it's hard to know exactly what policies she would be championing as vice president right now. But she has, looking at her record in the Senate and looking at her record in California, I think there might be some clues as to what she might want to champion when she becomes vice president, if she becomes vice president.
And I'm wondering too, what you thought of Obama's sort of warning to the country of democracy being at stake, and whether you think that Biden can rely on the Obama coalition to vote for him in November.
Yeah, so Obama's speech was pretty striking. Here is a former president of the United States telling the American people that their democracy is on the ballot. That has escalated the rhetoric coming from, especially Barack Obama, who's generally more of an optimist, and it kind of shows you how pivotal and dangerous of a moment we're in right now. I do think there are many people who are worried about democracy in America right now. And, if you've been watching the RNC, the question is not whether authoritarianism is going to come to America in Trump's second term. The reality is that authoritarianism is already here in America. Donald Trump has been using the powers of the presidency in order to help his reelection bid. He's been undermining the post office. The reason he was impeached was that he used his powers in the presidency to leverage, a foreign power to give him dirt
Yep.
on his opponent. So so this is not he is not a democratic um, president ideologically. Trump does not really believe in democracy. And, I mentioned this earlier, the fact that his party now does not even have a platform and that their platform is to just support him absolutely is concerning. So the reality is that authoritarianism is here in America. It's just a matter of whether or not it's going to take hold. I mean, we might end up seeing mass voter suppression in November if the post office is not able to deliver mail-in ballots on time, which that is a large concern right now. So I do think that Obama speech resonated with a lot of people because there are a lot of people worried about all of those things right now. And Trump has not only just exhibited those authoritarian tendencies that people tend to articulate, but he's actually exhibited that behavior, and he has done things in that pattern that themselves are warning signs about the direction of where the country is going. So, it's just a matter of whether or not authoritarianism is going to take hold in America. So,
And many Americans will cast their vote this November via the mail. However, the new Postmaster General, Louis DeJoy, has fundamentally changed the operation of the post office. And Fayad says we should all be concerned.
Americans should absolutely be concerned with Louis DeJoy's hearing and what Trump is doing with the post office right now. This is going to be the most mailed in election in American history, unless something happens between now and November. As a result of the pandemic and social distancing guidelines, people don't want to risk their health and risk contracting the coronavirus by going to their polling locations. Mail-in voting has been an option in this country for a very long time, and people rely on the mail to actually cast their ballots. But now, when the country needs the post office to help administer this election more than ever before, we have a president who wants to undermine that very institution. And so, how can we expect the post office to process and deliver all of these ballots on time if they have a postmaster general and a president keen on not making that possible? In any other year, this would totally be a manageable task for the post office to take. The Postal Workers Union mentioned this the other day, but if every single American voted, even people who aren't of voting age, but if every single American had sent in a mail-in ballot come November, that would only make about 75% of how much mail they deliver in one single day. So it's definitely a manageable task for the post office to undertake. But Louis DeJoy has, he's removed sorting machines, over 600 sorting machines across the country, which decreases the efficiency of mail delivery. He has removed letter boxes. He has stymied overtime pay and discouraged overtime pay, which makes delivery routes impossible to actually meet within a single day. So these kinds of reforms happening just before the election are certainly alarming, and everybody should be alarmed by them.
Yeah, I've got two more for you, and the first has to do with Biden has also said he wants to be a standard bearer for the next sort of transitional candidate for the next generation. So, what do you think Harris's appointment to the VP nomination means for that?
I mean, I think that kind of shows you what Biden thinks of the future of the Democratic Party. So, there's a good chance that Biden will only serve one term, that he might not run for a re-election. He has not indicated that himself, but he is 77 years old right now. He will be 78 if he is inaugurated. And so by his re-election campaign, he'll be over 80 years old. He will be the oldest president in American history. Um, Obviously, people age at different paces, so we don't know how fit he will be for a second term. He might be fit for a second term and he might want to seek a second term, but he is largely perceived by voters as a transition candidate to the next leader. And so he clearly views Kamala Harris as somebody who will take the mantle after his presidency. And he certainly seems to be happy with that choice. I think, Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, are more ideologically aligned than, say, Joe Biden is with Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders or, Julian Castro. So there is a clear, you know, ideological idea that Biden has of where the party should go. So, and he wants to keep it in the more, moderate wing of the party. But again, if Biden only runs one term, Kamala Harris will have a good shot at being the Democratic nominee in 2024. If he runs two terms, she has a good shot at being the nominee in 2028. But at the same time, there's a good chance that she'll face some opposition from the left wing of the Democratic Party. So it's really unknown how this unfolds in the next decade or so.
Yeah, and you piqued my interest, so I do have a follow-up question for the Republican part of this before I get to my last question. And my next question for you has to do with uh, assuming President Trump loses in November, what do you think it does to the state of the Republican Party? Because certainly most of the Senate, and the reason he wasn't impeached was because the Republicans in the Senate saved him. So most of the Republicans have been in lockstep with Trump and what he's trying to do with the country. But assuming he loses, what do you think that does to the state of the Republican Party?
Yeah, I mean, the Republican Party has been, going through a transformation since 2012, since Mitt Romney lost in 2012. So there was a faction of the party that thought they had to, um, you know, kind of, change on issues and start to build a broader coalition that reaches out to non-white voters. Because the Republican Party is largely a party that is representative of white Americans and not really anybody else. But then there was the faction like Donald Trump who doubled down on that strategy that increasing white voter turnout would win them the presidency again. And he was right. But if he loses, and especially if he loses by a landslide, which is possible, I really don't know how this election is going to turn out, but a landslide is possible. And if he loses, then there will likely be a reckoning with a lot of Republicans and a lot of people quickly abandoning Trump. But at the same time, I think Trumpism is still a very powerful force in the US, and it's not going to just disappear. But if he loses, you might see more Republicans, including Republicans in office, that are more moderate, like Baker in Massachusetts, like Hogan in Maryland, the Republican governors, um, kind of speak more explicitly against Trumpism than they are right now. Right now, Republicans are afraid, especially Republicans in power, even if they disagree and with Trump and find Trumpism very disagreeable, are they don't really have the courage to stand up to him because they worry that they will be punished at the ballot box for taking a stand against the president. If the president loses, then you might hear a lot more of those voices come out and try to take control of the party and moderate the party a little bit, move it towards the center a little bit more. But there will very likely be a big fight within the Republican Party as to which direction it goes in after Trump, whether it doubles down on Trumpism or abandons it altogether. And you're going to likely see two paths and two different kinds of candidates, emerge, and we'll just see how the Republican base votes. But all while thinking of this, keep in mind that the Republican base has largely bought into Trumpism. So it's hard to see that disappear within one election cycle.
And then my final question for you is we're about 63 days away from election day. So I'm just curious to get your thoughts on if Biden wins, what direction you think the country is going to go in. And if Trump wins, which direction you think it may go in. And also, what do you think will be the deciding factors leading up for voters for election day?
Yeah, I mean, so if Biden wins, America is at a turning point right now. The pandemic has unleashed an economic crisis that is the worst since the Great Depression. George Floyd's killing has galvanized a social movement that is, larger than anyone we've seen since the civil rights movement in the 1960s. He'd be, assuming office after, one of the most dangerous presidents in American history, and who has, practically hollowed out democratic institutions in the country. So if Biden wins, he has an opportunity to be a very consequential president, and he has to seize the moment. He might not meet the moment. There is that chance. But there is reason to feel optimistic about what can be done under a Biden administration, given what he and his running mate Kamala Harris have said on the campaign trail, which is that they are looking for solutions that are bigger than they previously thought. Biden, once the pandemic hit, said that he's looking at an FDR-sized presidency. And FDR famously transformed the country. And so, I think there is an opportunity here to fundamentally change America for the better, to change healthcare so that people don't rely solely on their employers, to have healthcare at an affordable rate that people, there is a larger appetite for Medicare for all now than there was before the pandemic. And the movement is going to keep pushing for that. There is reason for optimism when it comes to racial justice, under a Biden administration, because, if the movement continues, he's going to have to answer to the movement in a way that Trump never will. So some progress will likely get done under a Biden administration. I think the country might, go in a relatively good direction. But that's also largely unknown. So, and if Trump wins, it goes without saying, but if Trump wins, I think it would be pretty devastating for American democracy and for, people across the country. So, I mean, I think that's a very dangerous path for the country to go down. Yeah, I mean, the pandemic, this is the election happening during a pandemic. Everybody is thinking about the pandemic. Most workers have reported working from home for at least some portion of their jobs. So people's lives have totally changed. 40 million Americans are out of work. Unemployment is over 10% right now. Over 1 million people are filing for unemployment every week. And filing for unemployment for the first time every week. So, the U.S. has fundamentally changed since March. And so the pandemic and the economy are on people's minds. Healthcare, because of the pandemic, and even before the pandemic was on people's minds, but now is especially on people's minds when they're voting. And racial justice, the question of how far this country has come with regards to racial justice and whether or not it's enough. And it's clearly not enough. And so I think that's on the mind of voters as well come November. So, those, and thinking about all of those subjects, I think Trump has, failed at, meeting any of the needs that people have with regards to any of those topics. So I think those issues are really important, and I think those issues are what people are going to be thinking about when they vote in November.
Hey, Abdul, we want to thank you for an extensive and extended conversation about the selection of Kamala Harris as Joe Biden's running mate and the state of the U.S. presidential election. Really appreciated and enjoyed the conversation. So I want to thank you for your time this morning. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Kevin. I really appreciate it.